Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is apex predators. Is life better at the top? Part 2. And it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Kristina Disney. Kristina, thanks for coming back and sharing part 2 with us today. Really looking forward to it. So I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you so much, Sunny. I'm excited to pick up the story sort of where we left off. For those who weren't in last week, or if you've never joined for a webinar with myself, my name is Kristina Disney, and I've been a guide working with NatHab since, I guess, 2018. And so it's been a real joy to use these webinars to share some love of nature. So I'll kind of just do a brief, I won't go too much into it, but I just wanted to maybe catch people a little bit up on what we covered last week. And so we were talking, really it's all about apex predators, right? But as much as we view it almost as this pyramid, it really is this sort of tangled yarn or thread that weaves all these different organisms together in these multitude of ecosystems. And one thing that I think is really amazing about Canada's apex predators is that our apex predators often transcend, ecosystem boundaries, and they exist all across our nation, which is pretty cool. And it just shows how diverse and flexible they are and how they fit into all these different niches. And so we last time focused mostly on the gray wolf. So today, we have the second largest population of gray wolves next to Russia as far as sort of national boundaries go. And really, for us in Canada, so this map here is showing you that the dark orange is the current range that you can find wolves, and then the light orange is the former range. So as far as Canada goes, we really do actually have about 90% of the wolves, let's call it traditional territory, still covered by wolves. But the one thing, these maps are always deceiving, I think, or at least they can be, because it's giving you a visual dispersal, but that's not actually showing you livelihoods, quality of health, population dynamics, right? It's just showing where they can still be found. So if we look at this map and we think about it, and we can sort of start thinking about numbers behind that range. So today's population through North America is around 50 to 60,000 is the estimate, right? And I'm showing you that used to be, it's really about half the area. But what we guess as far as pre-European contact, the population of wolves to be at a minimum around 250,000, potentially even maybe as high as 2 million, depending on range and things like that. But we don't have exact numbers for those, right? And so that's something to think about, is that, if we don't look at borders and boundaries politically, if we just look at North America as a whole, we can see that roughly wolves cover half the territory that they used to, but their population is at the minimum about a fifth of what it once was, if we go with the lowest estimate, right? So it's really changed a lot. And so last time I introduced, focusing in on Canada, sort of the 5, and this is really broad strokes, but 5 biomes that you can find here in Canada. So that if we work from west to east, that bright pink on the left side, that's BC's coastal rainforest, or it's a temperate coniferous forest is the really broad term. And then the largest green band there, right, that's the boreal or the taiga, which does have, differences as you go from east to west, but it's our main ecosystem that covers us, from sea to sea, truly. And then above that, we have the tundra ecosystem, right? So that's where you're going to have, people often think about it as this barren wasteland, but in reality, it's one of the most productive zones in the short amount of time that it does thaw. That's why millions and millions of birds migrate up there, is because it is this really productive ecosystem. And then if we go back to south, if we go to that purple in the center, that's what I would grow up calling the prairies or the grasslands, right? Is that traditional territory. There are some shrubs, but really it's a largely open plain, either short grass or long grasses. And then this map I feel like gives it a little bit of disservice, but sort of in along the Great Lakes, we have that temperate forest, which could either be mixed coniferous or broadleaf, but more, when you think about your big, beautiful falls and your changing colors, that kind of forth. And it does go, I think, a little bit further north than what this map gives it credit for. But those were the 5 ones that I kind of wanted to overview, and that the idea being that these apex predators exist throughout them, right? And they often, these are not borders for them. Now, it's different livelihoods for them depending on which one they survive in. But the thing that as far as Canada goes, because we do have so much of this boreal, and because most of our population is along the southern border, it's where you can see how those ecosystems reflect the relationship that we've had with apex predators. So last time we really focused in on the grasslands or the prairies, which is where I grew up. And we talked about how the wolf used to be a part of that, but settlers coming in, especially agriculture, right? It's the really big one. Once you're settled and you have domesticated animals, large predators are not just a threat. It's not about the threat, almost less so to yourself as an individual, but it is to your livelihood of those being the means that you're going to survive there. And that's why so many apex predators are eradicated from agricultural areas, right? So for me, the life that I grew up in, there were no gray wolves. We grew up with coyotes. That was the main predator that was preying on the animals in that were our livelihoods. And so we sort of talked about the mosaic of what that is like today, and how it's not going to ever be the same. We're not going back in time, but that landscape, that prairie landscape, is now a mosaic of farmland, and there's about 20% of that native prairie still left there. And that the ecosystem has changed, the main players have changed, the main herbivores have changed. And this idea around, well, it's really just the longstanding controversy with all apex predators coming back into an environment, because on one hand, and then it also comes down to different people's beliefs, because for some people, we believe that there's no longer space for wolves in these environments, right? That they're never going to come back. They're not meant to. That world is gone. Other people believe that since we are the ones who change their environment, we're responsible for providing for them, almost more as a steward role, and that we have to think about, so do you reintroduce them to places they no longer exist, or do you simply protect the places they already are? And it is going to come down to a compromise somewhere in the middle, because when you do have wolves and when you do have healthy functioning apex predators back into an ecosystem, it functions so much better. We've seen it. We've finally gone back to some of the old ways of understanding that we can't have this we can't monocrop ecology. It's not going to work. The ecosystems won't survive. They will fail, and with that failure comes much higher consequences. And so we see that now, but then also there's so many more people living in these places, and so we don't know how it's going to hash out and what the compromise is going to be, but it's on its way there, right? And right now, this is how it is as a mesopredator has stepped in. The coyote was, before, we wouldn't have traditionally called it an apex predator, but now where the wolves are lacking, it has filled that role, right? And so maybe that will be enough, or maybe that is how it will settle out. So that's a lot of what we talked about last time. And before I take us further and look at some other species, what I want to do is take everyone and take us back in time. Because I think one thing that's really important to understand when we understand ecosystems and changes to them is that nature has never been, nor will it ever be, static. And we have a hard time understanding that. And I mean that as like the proverbial we, and then the individual, and me, myself, right? But the idea that the world is always changing, and so we only have this snapshot of understanding of it. And so this might look a little dry, right? But when we think about the world as we see it now, and let's just think about North America, right? But there's a really big change that happens between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, and that's essentially around 11,000 years ago. And that mark has to do with a lot of climate change and the disappearance of continental glaciers. And that's essentially what causes the extinction of a lot of megafauna. And if your eyes are starting to glaze over, hang out, stay with me, because even though, the words that I'm saying and what the dates that were presented, we often represent in history with these terrible bar graphs of history, which always bore me. But this is really what we're talking about, right? Is these amazing megafauna species that used to exist all throughout the continent that are gone now, that we have never seen nor will ever see again, right? There is the Paraceratherium, which was essentially this giant hornless rhino. There were woolly rhinos and woolly camels, and there were native horse species. And the Amphicyon was this like weird cross between a bear and a dog, and they weren't really sure. And that thing in the back is actually, the Megatherium is a giant sloth. It's not a predator, it's a herbivore, even though you look at those massive claws and you might be thinking otherwise. And so the reason, why I want to bring all of this up is because it's about placing our ecosystem and our predators that we have today in this much greater context. right? These are some of the giants of North America, many of whom are extinct now. It was about 38 different species that went extinct, right? And so the predators that evolve now are small. They're actually these mid-range predators that outlasted and survived these climate changes to exist in today's world. And so when you think about the connections that these predators have to their prey and to their ecosystem as a whole, you always have to look at your family of origin if you want to understand where something came from. It's like siblings in a family, right? The oldest child, the middle child, the youngest child, they all have these different roles that they have the potential to fill. And the same thing exists within these relationships in an ecosystem, right? These predators started off in a different role than what we would have assigned them 11,000, 15,000 years ago when this was some of their competition. And it's also important to understand why that world changed, right? So when I was in school, I distinctly remember being taught that, there were no humans in North America, and they came across on the land bridge from Asia, from Beringia, and when they came across, they hunted and killed all the big animals, and that's why they're not here anymore. And we call that, one of the things they call it now in anthropology is overkill. The idea being that they hunted things to extinction, and that theory still exists, but there's a lot. It's not just accepted, I guess, as blanket, as a universal term, I guess is what I'm trying to say, as it was in the 60s when this idea sort of first really blossomed and took off. And it's because it has to do with the overlapping of humans arriving and climate changing. And it's not quite chicken and egg, but whether one precedes the other, and that's why the animals are gone. But there's a huge climate shift that happens there. And so when we look at that, essentially the schools of thought are that there is a large climate change happening, and that's why humans were able to come. And so some people say that, okay, well, once the humans arrived, then they started hunting all these megafauna. But if you look at those 38 species that went extinct, lots of them were ones that humans didn't interact with, or they would not have been a prey species. And they still underwent changes. Lots of them still went extinct. The ones that didn't go extinct that remained, they still went these really broad transitions. So it shows that there were big changes happening. And whether that overkill was the sole reason seems to be less and less the narrative. It's still certainly part of it, but it's not the whole story. So what this graph here is showing you is there's a few different animals. There's the mammoth mastodon, I can't remember what the middle one is, the equus, so that's like the horse, and the smilodon, so your saber tooth. And if you look at the bottom, it's showing you age in thousands of years. So actually the left side is the most recent, and then as you go to the right, you're going further and further in the past. And so what this is showing you is that you can see that there's all these species that exist in North America, and then as the humans who have been existing for a little while, their population starts to rise, and you can see all the other animals' populations rising and sinking, and they having their own dynamics, right? But then you hit that 12,000, 13,000 mark is when they all start to really decline, and humans sort of start to increase and plateau, forgiven that, right? And so when we think about that, that's where that overkill hypothesis came from, that our interaction with these other apex predators is the reason why they vanished, and not just either directly hunting them, like the smilodon, like the saber-toothed tiger, or hunting their prey, right? Like the woolly horses that would have existed back then. And so what this study did that I've been showing you is they kind of broke it down by region rather than just saying this blanket term, oh, humans were there and so then it was gone. And I really love it. This is what I love about science. We use all this big proper math just to go back to awesome pictures. So, right, if it's the cloud and the snow, it's the changing climate that most likely ended that area. And then if it's the hunter, then that's where, and you can see the timelines, right? And so they've broken it up into sort of like continental US, the Southwest US, and then the Great Lakes area. So it's more like New York and Ontario and Canada and things like that. And the other thing I wanted to point out, when I didn't point out in the previous picture, is that the two color schemes you're seeing here, right? So that orange that you're looking at represents what's called the Clovis culture or the Clovis period. So that's when humans are developing, let's call them our basic set of stone tools, right? And that's where hunting becomes more prolific. And then the light blue that is what is the period that's known as the Younger Dryas, which has happened around 13,000 to 11,700 years, give or take a little bit. And so the reason why this is colored and why this is important and why these little clouds here are happening and why we have that cold snap. So what's happening if we were to take a step back and and look at Earth's bigger history right now is that Earth had been on this trend of warming. It was coming out of a glacial period, right? Canada has essentially been covered by kilometers of ice for the last how many thousands and thousands of years. And it's coming out of that period into an interglacial period. So it's a time of warming. But even though it's on that general trend, this 1,000 odd years here, not quite 2,000 years, in blue represents when there's this 1,000-year cold snap, and it sort of regresses that general warming and brings it back into a glacial period where the continental ice sheets start extending again. The temperature on Greenland drops by about 4 or 10 degrees, and so there's this huge temperature swing. And the reason why we think this happened, which this is not the time to go into the side story, but basically there's a huge outleash. There was a big dam of fresh water in central Canada that got broken. It's called Lake Agassiz. Flooded the ocean, changed a bunch of circulation, caused a bunch of big changes, and didn't change globally. There's still places, in the southern hemisphere that are warming at this time. But for North America, this was really, really traumatic because what happened was that in a matter of decades, it went through this massive climate swing. And I realize this is a lot of history, and I'm bringing it up because, we look at this 1,000-year period that was kicked off in the matter of decades because it was a crux point. It was a really, really big change, right? And we're sort of sitting on the precipice of another one. And if we know that history repeats itself and we see that this is what happened in the last really dramatic change went on, you can understand sort of what the concerns are for our future day. But back to just apex predators in general. The other reason why I brought all of this up is because this is the era where we're losing a lot of these large megafauna roles, so in the ecosystem, and they're being replaced, right? But these are the predators that, today's polar bear, right? Because polar bears, the bears that we know now, sort of that Ursus family, polar bears are the youngest. They've been around for 200,000 years. Black bears, they've been around for about 8, I think. Actually, I might have that wrong. Don't quote me on that one. Or sorry, 8 million. They've been around for a long time, right? But they've been coexisting in North America with these other species, right? So this bear that you're seeing on the left is a Arctodus simus. So that's also like the short-faced bear, which would have been massive. These things weigh like 900 kilograms. So you're looking at more than 2,000 pounds. And at their shoulder alone, they were 2 meters tall. Really long, almost like more fine bone legs. Definitely. So this is something that would have been, competing with or potentially even hunting other bears, right? There was the saber-toothed tiger. There is the scimitar tiger. Sorry. And there is the American cave lion, right? All of these things. There's the dire wolf. All of these massive, massive predators overlapped with the apex predators that we know today, and they would have been the underdogs. The ones that we know today, they were not the top of the food chain. These animals were, right? So this map here, it shows you essentially interspecies competition, and this one is based around the short-faced bear, and just where the highest amount of competition would have occurred. And so that, it's hard for us to sometimes understand that these changes, they've been happening for a long time, right? And so when we see changes, that predators have gone in the last 300 years because of us, it's very drastic, right? But also they've been living in competition. I guess, when we named this thing is Better Life, Better on the Top, it's because you can always fall off the top, right? You never stay there. It's never a permanency. And so, okay, so with that, I want to bring it back to the predators we've been talking about more, or currently, I guess. And so last time we talked quite a bit about wolves and we talked about coyotes, and this time we're going to shift and we're going to talk about bears. That's what we're going to focus on today. And with that, not only focusing on bears, but I actually just want you to look at this picture of the bear itself. I can't help but point this out because it's sort of, I'm really fascinated by it. So if you look at this bear's teeth, they're really, really worn down. This is a grizzly. It's quite old, but remember that they are omnivorous. Even though we have them pegged as this apex predator, they fill multiple roles, and they're often, the reason why they've got those really big claws is actually because they spend more time digging. right? But this bear has worn down its teeth so much that it's nearly to the gums on the left side, right? And that's also a sign of like livelihood, and right. So this bear's niche, wherever it is, it is still a predator, but it's definitely been more of a eating grubs and things like that. Anyway, sorry, I just thought it was cool and I couldn't help but point it out. So let's talk about bears. When we look at Canada, we have the big three, right? We have polar bears all through our Arctic and somewhat into our subarctic ecosystems. We have grizzlies predominantly on the west coast and a bit in the northern interior. And then we have black bears almost essentially everywhere, except for that agricultural belt that I had pointed out to you before with the wolves. So let's start by focusing on the grizzlies. So the map that I showed you before is a map of current ranges. This is a map now looking at current versus historical, right? So the dark gray is where we are currently finding grizzly bears, and the historical range is that light gray all the way down, right? All the way down and through to Mexico. And then it's an interesting one, right? Because I'm pretty sure that California still has a grizzly bear on its flag, even though they haven't had bears there probably since the late 1800s. So when we think about bears, right, and we think about them as, I just got done pointing out its teeth and the idea that, you know, there's these multiple roles that they're filling. They're habitat generalists, right? So we're finding them all the way from the Arctic, in the old days, all the way down to the bottom of the continent, but certainly now still into coastal rainforests. And their main food sources vary depending on where they're at, right? Our coastal bears, they're the ones that are relying predominantly like on of salmon, right? You go interior, they're hunting caribou, they're hunting elk, things like that. Deer, there are, you know, lots of berries that they're surviving on. And it's the idea that, you know, they're carnivore, and that's what their digestive system is designed for, but they are functionally omnivorous. And some of them are even primarily herbivores, right? It all depends on where you find them. It actually decides whether they're filling an apex role or not, right? It's very, very variable. And so when we zoom in, I guess, a little bit, and we just think about, you know, when we talk about maps, right? I always want to put numbers behind maps because the visuals can be deceiving. And so there are currently around 25,000, 30,000 grizzlies estimated in Canada. Probably about half of those you can find in British Columbia. And then you're going to find the rest sort of in the Rockies and then going northwards. And population wise, so if we look at the dispersal of that, the numbers go where it's about a 50% decline from what it was pre-1880s, right? So that means that really there was probably at a time more like 60,000 grizzlies that we found here, right? But the pressure of settlement of Europeans coming across and settling has changed that number drastically. So in Canada, what we use to sort of label the concern level for different wildlife is called the Committee of the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, right? So we have extinct, extirpated, which is applied to just if we no longer find them in Canada, which is always sort of a funny one when you think about managing animals by political boundaries, because on one hand it makes sense because you can control how different people behave. But I grew up right on the border with Montana and North Dakota, and in Canada, the what's it called? The prairie dog is considered very endangered and is almost completely extirpated from Canada. And so there's a lot of effort in different spots to make sure that they survive. Whereas if we cross the border, they're considered a nuisance, and there's like pest control things given out by the government to stop them. So you can tell that sometimes not all management strategies line up. But anyway, so the reason why I bring this up is that I want to go back to that region that I was talking about when I was talking about the coyotes and the wolves last time, and look at that from the view of sort of grizzly bears. And so their eradication of grizzly bear, they were the plains grizzly bear. They were actually probably one of the larger subspecies. They might have even been able to give some of the Katmai bears a run for their money as far as size. And they've been extirpated. Their, I guess, decline was in tandem with the hunt of the bison, sort of that clearing out, not because they were predators of them, but because of the livelihoods and the lifestyles that were changing, right? So the bison were eradicated to get rid of a nomadic lifestyle and bring in settlers. And that is the pairing with which we lost the plains grizzly as well. And this is what that sort of landscape looks like today, right? So it used to be a mix of tall grass and short grass prairie with shrubs and some parkland. And it's relatively flat because it all used to be an underwater sea, right? And so then but it does have some rolling hills. And today you're going to find most of that as sort of hayland or cropland. And there hasn't been really bears here since the 1880s. There are a few exceptions to that. And it comes from the odd sighting of these sort of small rural places that managed to survive. But when we talk about these places, it's not just we forget that it was incentivized to get rid of them. It wasn't just direct competition. In clearing this space for people to come and live in, there was an expedition. This one was from 1871, where a man who was on the Palliser expedition received 750 grizzly skins in Cypress Hills. So Cypress Hills is, if you go to the bottom of this map between Alberta and Saskatchewan, where their border is, there's a little region there. It's one of the few places in Canada that didn't get glaciated. So it's got nice soil and decent hills. And it's one of the places where the grizzlies were still surviving there, right? So they were just getting completely cleared out. And, there's stories from these old expeditions of the horses, that still had scars from the grizzlies on them long after all the grizzlies had been killed there. And so you can understand the fear that built it up. But it was because there was a whole shift in that ecosystem happening, right? We think about the loss of the bears, but it's a loss of a whole ecosystem, right? And it's not and the bears are simply one part of that. And so some of the islands, you could almost call them, where they were last found, there was sightings of grizzlies in the 1950s and 60s in these places. So essentially these were hills that were less settled. There were fewer occupants coming in, and there were these little islands, but they were probably the last ones that were killed out were in the 50s and 60s there. And there's been I don't know if it happens every generation or if it goes through phases, but there's always talk about rewilding, the idea of bringing these predators back in. And in some places it's possible, and in some places it's not. And so when they were thinking about this, the government has put in a considerable amount of research to decide whether or not they could bring grizzlies back to the prairies. And they broke it down essentially that they would need a habitat and what that criteria would be. So their suitable habitat, they decided, was that there needed to be minimum 900 square kilometer area, that the road density of that had to be less than 0.6 kilometers per square kilometer, that the human occupancy of an area for grizzlies to come back and be viable had to be less than half a human per square kilometer, and that less than 10% could be cultivated land, so it couldn't be cropland or hayland. So basically you're talking about native grass ecosystems. And so what you're seeing on this map, so secure habitat, so that bright green are places that are already protected. They're native and they're either parks or some sort of reserve. And then suitable habitat range is that sort of tan color around those, because they didn't want to, project a safe habitat without having an already secured and protected region attached to it. And so when you look, this is that same area that I was just pointed out, sort of between Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And there's not a lot of places left for them that you could put them back into, right? We talk about, really, the wolves in Yellowstone are this poster child of reintroduction, but it's a massive tract of land that's unbroken, unfragmented, right? Whereas, and then you have to think about the probability of this ever happening. Not only would you have to have an ecosystem that could support the bears, but then you'd have to have all of the people in the region be on board with it, which culturally there's still so much fear around bears, especially grizzly bears, that it's unlikely to ever happen. Really, when I look at this map, it sort of reflects two things. One is that these are places that will never have that apex predator role filled again, unless by chance they migrate there on their own, and then they could potentially be protected, but no one would ever agree to bringing them back. I mean, that's my own opinion, really. But it's also showing you where the small bits of intact ecosystem still exist, right? And it's really just this paint smattering across the landscape. And for me, I actually grew up in one of these, which I guess is why sometimes I have such maybe a skewed perception. I grew up in Saskatchewan, where it says Grasslands National Park. I essentially grew up right there, 10 kilometers from it. And I grew up surrounded by a lot of native prairie. And so to me, I would go and I'm surrounded by lots of farmland too as a kid, but it was part of the way I grew up. And, it's not even that massive tract of land that where I grew up seems so big. When I zoom out and look at it on a map like this, I realize that it's not enough to sustain that, because in order to have that ecosystem, it was all about movement. That's the thing about the prairies, is that it's a low productivity zone and you have to be able to cover huge ranges. And we can make that compromise with herbivores because we can bring in food, or we can just, we can decide how it's grazed. But you can't change that nomadic lifestyle in a predator. They need to be able to move to feed. And so there's no way we'd ever be able to bring it back. And that's one of the reasons why, they've been able to survive in, different boreal places, because the settlement density is lower, but also productivity is higher in different places. And so they can have smaller regions and still have a livelihood there, right? And so I think about the loss of bears from this prairie is sort of a representation of that loss of that whole nomadic lifestyle. Neither one of those can really come back anymore, which even as an adult still makes me a bit sad. But so far, I know I've been talking about where the bears no longer are. So let's go back and talk about where we still find grizzlies and where they're still a huge part, playing a huge role in their ecosystems. So the highest density of bears, when we look at this as far as Canada goes, is sort of the mountain range between BC and Alberta. So that's that squiggly. We've got the two provinces on the west here, and then squiggly line. That's essentially the Rockies. That's where the bears are there. And then we have the coastal grizzlies, and then we have moving north into BC and the Yukon, and also we have some way up in the tundra as well. And when we look at this, so this is the range. Now, as far as existing protection for their habitat, only about 8% of occupied grizzly habitat is classified as protected in Canada right now. So that means everywhere else they can still be hunted. There's still activities that might degrade habitat quality, and it's not really, or at least in the past, has not been on the forefront of management decisions as to where they fit into that. And so that's why things like this get created, where it's the threatened grizzly populations, right? So Alberta, this is where they're under threat. The gray is where you no longer find them, but they would have been once. And the red is where they're threatened in BC. And, in the past, I've been saying settlement and settlers in this past sense, but it's still applicable today. And we can look at that. The easiest way that they've actually found to reflect that is with road densities. So this is a map showing grizzly bear watershed habitat and road densities, and this is the overlaying map of where they're threatened, right? So you can see how that's coming to be. And it's interesting because it's not the roads themselves that are the harm. It's not necessarily, roadside strikes or car accidents that are the threat. It's about the overlap of human interaction and bear interaction, and then also in tandem with that is habitat fragmentation. So what I mean by that is that when we look at where bears are struggling the most, it is closest to human populations, but it's also where we've broken up habitat into the smallest little pieces. And that makes it really, really complicated for them to have survival rates. So when you're looking at a population health, usually the way that you measure it is through female health and their cub survival rate, right? And so there's a certain amount of stability that they need to raise their cubs as far as food availability and habitat survival. And roads have a really big effect on that. I'll cover this first and I'll come back to the roads. So this is what I was talking about, where it's not necessarily the fact that the people are near a road, or it's not the fact that they're getting hit by a truck, it's that they get scared away, so they actually lose their habitat in that way. But then also you just have a higher range of overlap of bears interacting with humans, and then that resulting in their death, right? So we have a saying pretty common that a fed bear is a dead bear, right? And so there's the statistics, it's somewhere between 77 and 90% of grizzlies die because of a human, like they're actively shot or hunted or trapped. Right. So when you think about a population and you think about the fact that we are, as a species, are the ones that are responsible for the majority of their deaths in their population, it's actually kind of wild, right? We are their apex predator, right? In that way, because so many of them, think about that, 90% of deaths, especially most bears that are dying are teenagers. They're, that 2 to 5 range, when they're the most curious, and they're also the most hungry because they haven't learned to hunt properly yet, things like that. But the majority of grizzlies don't get to become old bears, right? It's because of these interactions. And so back to the habitat side of that, if you were thinking about securing, so each one of these networks shows you the same amount of area, but the idea of different densities of dispersal, right? So if you, every time you break it up, you're making a smaller and smaller secure area, which is actually less functional, right? Because, everyone needs so many square feet in their house to survive, whatever that may be for your number. But the bears, they need a certain size of area, and that number actually changes depending on where they're at, right? A coastal bear actually needs a smaller habitat range because there's a higher amount of food availability than, say, an interior bear or a bear up north. They would need to cover way more ground to have the same amount of food resources available, right? So there isn't like a perfect number on this, but this study was done for Alberta and for BC. So, right. And when we think about, making this a part of management decisions, I'm not saying that we can go back from a lot of it, right? We have these massive road networks and we may never change them, right? Hopefully we do change some of them. But the idea is that when we build things in the future, or we make choices in the future, is to factor in not just our needs, but the ecosystem needs, right? And that's kind of what this is about, is trying to shift our behavior. And if we did wanted to, make the effort to change some of that, to go back from it and see it, right? There's ways that we could actually work it backwards to reopen that habitat. And they end up being, there's a whole bunch of other studies about corridors when we leave roads behind. And it's not a band-aid. It's not going to make it all better. There's a bunch of things that have to do with it, but it is a part of it. And so this is one specific study. There are lots of other issues that come up, but I wanted to focus on this one for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a really, literally everyone has been on a road or driven on a road, right? So it's a part of our life that we didn't even realize is one of the things that's affecting a huge ecosystem, or affecting things on a predator level, but on an ecosystem level. And the other thing is that this is the title of the publication I just showed you, and the publication date is January 2020. Right? This is a conversation that's still happening now. It's still very valid. It's still very important, and we're starting. It's almost like we put the cart in front of the horse. We've gone and done all these things. We're now understanding the consequences of them, right? And so, if we are going to be at the top of this totem pole, or top of this food chain, then it comes with a certain amount of responsibility as to, maybe we've done things in the past, but how is it that we choose to go with them in the future? So it's a cool study. If you want to take a snapshot of that and go check it out, if you want to read more about it, you are more than welcome to. But alas, I am going to shift away from grizzlies, and we're going to talk about black bears now. So our black bear friends are the most diverse range coming across Canada. And they inhabit 12 out of our 13 provinces. Essentially, the only one they actually can't be found on is Prince Edward Island, but pretty much everywhere else you can find black bears in Canada. They are not part of that. Historically you would have found them in the prairies, but you don't find them anymore, right? And they for the same reason that we talked about. When we try to match some population numbers to this, depending on which estimate you're looking at. Some of them have as low bark biology as 600,000. Most people settle around there's probably 900,000 black bears in North America. It seems to be about half of those are in Canada, give or take a little bit, maybe more. So when we think about that, so there's way more bears, right? I said that in total for grizzlies, there's probably around 30,000, right? So this is a whole order of magnitude greater. And that's one of the reasons why there's just simply more human-bear interactions, right? The other reason, when we think about, black bears and humans over interacting, is the personality difference between these two species. So, grizzlies have a reputation that they do mostly follow, or a stereotype, let's say, that they follow through on, of being much more aggressive than black bears, right? And so because of that, sometimes when you hear about stories that happen with hikers, they don't give the bear the due respect. If it had been a grizzly, maybe they would have acted differently if it was a black bear, or vice versa. And in fairness, there is actually some ways you should behave differently because of it. But black bears are in general more timid than grizzly bears. And it's interesting because, you have to wonder why that is. They are slightly smaller than grizzlies, but again, in places, I just got done saying that if I go back and I flick and look at this map, pretty much grizzlies were only in the western part of Canada. So if you were going to say that they're timid because of their competition with grizzlies, in theory, it should only be western black bears that are timid and eastern black bears should be more aggressive. But in reality, it's a common trait that you find across the whole population. And this is why I wanted to bring up history, right? When we think about the evolution of the black bear, they were up against dire wolves and American lions and that giant short-faced bear. They are not high up on they're a mesopredator, right? They would have been in the middle ground of that. And their ability to climb trees, they actually would run and hide from these other predators, right? That's an advantage they had over some of these bigger bad boys. And so, that interaction, the way they behave, still happens with us today as humans. And so, it sort of brings us back to this idea that if you're going to be an apex predator and you're going to fill this role, it's that your role changes in space and in time, right? So whether the bears are on East Coast, West Coast, whether they are, north, south, how much food is available to them, right? That's what's going to decide in space today how they fill that apex predator role and how much pressure they put on the rest of these species underneath of them, right? If you have a grizzly bear on the coast that's predominantly feeding on salmon, it's not going to make a bunch of effort to go hunt elk and deer on the coast, right? And so that's going to change its role in the system. But then, so that's in space. But then in time, right, there are these other interactions that are happening. What ecosystems are flourishing, which ones are dying off, how is that changing, what other predators are hanging around. And so, we talk about mesopredators as when they become top of the food chain, you actually have a decrease in biodiversity because they're putting pressure on this. It essentially narrows the number of channels, right? If you have an apex predator that feeds on a wide range of things, then in highs and lows, there's lots of room for these sort of natural population swings to happen in multiple different species at different times. But when a mesopredator becomes the top of the food chain, they're going to only feed on the things that they're capable of feeding on, which means it actually narrows the bandwidth. It narrows what is going to be capable of surviving. And so not that this is a direct link, but it's another way to think about that loss. I said we used to have all of these species, we had all these other predators, and having that higher diversity of predators meant that we had a higher diversity in our whole ecosystem. And we've lost those. And so it's sort of important to remember that bears today actually only represent this one corner of the pyramid. They are a mesopredator moved into a previous existing role that was held by a saber-toothed tiger or was held by a short-faced bear. So this is kind of changing the view a little bit, but I wanted to talk about hunting bears a little bit more because so far we've talked about maybe the human bear interaction is more about competition over similar resources, but then there also is a direct interface of us directly hunting them for that purpose, right? Now, whether you still want to say that purpose is for food or for recreational hunting or for sport, as far as an ecosystem role goes, it fills the same thing. The only part that's missing is whether that body returns its nutrients back to the ecosystem, which does change with us. But otherwise, you could argue that it's still filling that apex predator role as humans. So humans, and then I am going to shift, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that happen on the east. So we'll talk about Ontario and its sort of provincial rules a little bit. So there have been, let's say, public incentives or bounties for hunting black bears in Ontario since the 1800s, right? And if you think about, I mean, I keep saying European settlers, but settlers came from everywhere. But Canada was settled moving from east to west, and that is reflected in so many things about our culture and how we all interact with each other. There's a little bit of that east-west competition that still happens, but especially in our wildlife, or whether you even want to call the word wilderness, right? So the fact that we used to have these plains grizzlies, and then as people moved from east to west, they got pushed into the mountains, and that's where we still today have the highest density of grizzlies, is reflected that ecosystem could hold it. But also there was that pressure in that, and so there's been hunting pressure on the eastern populations of black bears since settlers have arrived, right? That's been there from the get-go. And it's there, even today, there's been, I think there's about 20,000 bear, I gotta figure out the numbers. I think it's 20,000 bears per year, because there's 22,000 tags for black bear hunting. So let's say that not all of them get them. So let's say there's about 20,000 black bears that get hunted annually in Canada. And a lot of that is recreational hunting. Some of it is sustenance. A lot of it's trophy hunting. I mean, to be honest, I have a cousin who works as a bear guide up in Manitoba. It's still things that people come and take part in. And that relationship and the status of black bears, because they are so numerous, they don't have, when I was talking about our levels of how we endangered, threatened, etc., they're a not at risk species, but there's still a changing public opinion as to where they fit in and where we fit into their world, because we do overlap in so many different ways, right? We have family units, and there's different livelihoods that exist, and we really identify with their curiosity and their livelihood. So the pressure in the other direction, when they got rid of, there used to be open season hunting until 1999, and then that was stopped. But then when that happened, then people started to complain about the levels of predation on livestock and crops, right? Because another thing about bears is, when I was working on the coast this last summer, and it didn't even occur to me until I was out there, but I was walking along and there was this huge, huge pile of bright yellow bear scat because the bears were eating the corn. Didn't even occur to me that they would do that, but it makes sense, right? So it's that co-competition and long-standing fear that's really spiraled around. So I feel like I got a bit off track here, but this is what I wanted to bring it back to, is that we are going through another paradigm shift currently. And maybe that's presumptive of me to say, but I certainly feel like it's true for my generation, where historically, humans have viewed, or not all humans, but definitely those that founded Canada and lots of places, this idea that the natural world is there for us to provide for us solely, and that it, at any consequence, we will tame and conquer it. And we're shifting away from that to this idea of we're just another drop in the water or drop in the ocean. And that, when we thought, this idea of always knowing better and of making choices, what we think is the best does have consequences. Oh, sorry, my dog has just come to say hello. Hang on, sir. Go away. Okay. So I don't know what's going to come of this. I don't know where everything is going to settle out, but it's the story we're currently living, and I'm gonna hold out and hope for the best. I also realize I'm almost near the end of the hour, and I do have one more part. So instead of trying to rush through this, I'm going to start polar bears, and I'll just go for maybe 5 or 6 minutes. If I get it all done, great. And if not, I will pick it up with part 3 next week. So just keep that in mind. I don't want to crush through. So polar bears, actually, sorry, let me go back there. So, I've talked a lot about historic ranges versus current ranges, and you can see in this picture that polar bears do not have the same narrative that you find with grizzly bears and with black bears, right? More or less, their historic range is always been limited by climate and not by human expansion. Now that's changing a little bit, but that story holds mostly true today. And when we think about our relationship with them as an apex predator, really historically, there's a lot of mutual respect, but there's also been a lot of hunting of polar bears. And, that, let's call that the industrialization of that, is what became the real threat to them. So up until the 1970s, the biggest concern from polar bears, or that humans provided for polar bears, what we understood was hunting and overhunting. And that largely came from Russian, European, and American hunters, going to the Arctic on these big hunts and then selling the pelts. And that's, historically, we're talking about this. It's starting all the way from basically the 1600s, and it was this very lucrative thing, and so, but when you think about the change that happens, that change really kicks in 1973. So essentially, different countries got together, and it came down to being Russia, the US, Canada, Greenland, and Norway. And if you look at these subpopulations of polar bears, these are the countries where polar bears are currently inhabiting. And so when we think about it, people have been hunting polar bears on this bigger scale since the 1600s. But when I sort of said the industrialization of hunting, there's a lot of technology that gets invented at the turn of from the 1900s onwards that really ups the pressure on these bears, and people are realizing that some of these subpopulations are nearly decimated. And so that's what spurred the Polar Bear Agreement in 1973 between these 5 nations, and what changed to become arguably one of the most successful nationally joint conservation efforts that the world has seen. So its focus is in multiple different directions. Part of it was stopping overhunting, and I will say that of those 5 nations, so Russia actually stopped hunting in the 1950s, Norway stopped hunting in 1972, and Canada, the US also stopped, I think in the 70s. But Canada is the nation that actually still carries hunting forward today. And I work as a polar bear guide for NatHap, so I've known this, but I will say that there are a few things when I dug up for this presentation that were new to me too, and it was interesting to have a different perspective on this. So as far as hunting today in Canada, there has been a quota system and a harvest management system since the 70s. The number of bears, so right now globally there's about 25,000 polar bears, in the world. About 16,000 of them are estimated to be living in Canada or offshore from Canada, and the hunting quota for Canada is around 600. That number changes a little bit, but per year that's what it is. And the way that quota system works is that if there are bears shot for other reasons, then it gets taken down from the quota. In some places, it's also somewhat managed provincially. So, like, for example, in the province of Manitoba, hunting is not allowed. There are a limited number of tags. So for Ontario, they have a maximum of 30 bears. Quebec has a maximum of 62. The majority of the bears that get hunted, however, are in the Northwest Territories and in Nunavut. And so these bears provide, so there's the traditional hunting, which is why this has been maintained in Canada and why they chose as a nation to hold on to those rights. So any hunting that happens is through the indigenous group there, so normally Inuit. They're the ones who hold the tags. They have the rights to them as a community, and the communities decide what will happen with them. They either hunt them themselves and then choose to sell the furs. As you can see here from the price range, why that might be considered a lucrative business. Often one polar bear tag is enough to, feed and provide a family or, to be dispersed throughout the community and really take care of everyone for quite some time. And so as a government, that incentive was left there. And there are a lot of problems with this. I'm not going to pretend there isn't, and I'm not going to say, I think we could have a whole webinar just on the convoluted relationship of how this is developed. But this was the thing I wanted to point out, I guess, that I learned this time around is, so Fur Canada is how these polar bear skins get sold. And it's actually a government entity, which I didn't know. And I guess on some hand makes sense. And I have some qualms with this, because on one hand, I understand how it being a government entity and how it, the way it's set up is that hunters will sell their furs and the government gives them a certain amount of that money right from the get-go, so they have something to live off of until the rest of the sale happens. And so it sort of makes sense that there is a government-run entity that does this, but it also seems wrong that they're the ones, they lobby these other countries to get people to sell them. It's I don't know. I'm just gonna say I don't feel great about it, but I didn't understand that. The other thing is that, the world is changing, and the value of these is changing too. So one thing that happened last year was that over 200 of these hides were actually sent back from the auction house because they weren't sellable. And that has to do with a few different things. It's not just the idea that the market plummeted, but it had more to do with that, in the same way that, when beaver furs went out of, or beaver felts went out of fashion, that same sort of arc is happening here, where people only want the really highest quality of them, and there are these older hides that aren't getting sold. And so they've actually all been sent back to the hunters, but hunters can't afford to buy them back, right? So I said that the way it's set up now is that they often get part of that money first, but in order for them to get the hides back, the money they were given now is, whether it was 3-5 years ago that they had originally tried to go and sell these hides, is now more than what they would have gotten for the hide itself, because it's got the price on some of these other hides has dropped down to like $2,000 or $3,000 rather than making $10,000 or $20,000. And so it's really, really hard for people who this has been their livelihood for the last decade, or communities who've known that this is going to be a source of income. Now, there are some qualms about this being the source of income, and that there will be better opportunities to provide for it, but it is also a part of the way that they've lived for literally thousands of years, and trying to integrate something old into something new, it doesn't, or different systems of value, right? It gets really complicated. Oh, I'm sorry, I realize I'm running out of time. So I will maybe wrap this up a bit quickly. Okay, so all in all, when we think about polar bears now as their apex predator, the tourism is part of what's sort of changing and protecting them, but also is actually a threat to them too, right? Because we're increasing the amount of human interactions. And with climate change in general kicking over, you're going to have things being introduced that weren't there before. Things like parasites, things like diseases are going to become more and more common moving north in a bear species that essentially has very few, if little, interactions. Then you have bigger processes at work, right? You're looking at all the contamination that's making its way into the Arctic and trickling through the food chain. And probably one of the biggest threats coming to them, right, again, as we have climate change happening, is, the push to have more oil and gas exploration in the Arctic. There's huge amounts of resources there. Feel bad, I'm about to end on a doomsday, but I promise that we'll keep going with part 3, right? But then you're also just going to have more human settlement as we go north, and that needs to be managed in a certain way, because if it's not, you get situations like this, right, where they're having these huge negative interactions, and inevitably will only lead to the bear's demise. Now, all this is really sort of spiraling like the hurricane around changing this climate change, right? Because all these changes wouldn't be happening if we weren't losing sea ice, the ability to make all these other moves. And so, essentially we've been losing sea ice at about 10 or 13% every decade. And we've been losing multi-year ice, which is the really stable stuff, right? So that's what's able to survive for longer than 4 years. It used to make up about 15% of the ice pack. Now it makes up almost less than 1. And I think, for simplicity, I'm going to leave it on a cliffhanger there, because that next part will take me a bit too long. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to you, Sunny. I apologize for leaving the story half finished, but I promise if you come back next week, I will finish up with what I really want to say about the polar bears, because we're not quite to the end of it yet. But with that, I'm at the hour, so I will give it back to Sunny.
Thank you so much, Kristina. Always fascinating to hear how you put all these things together. I would love to be inside your brain for a day or two. But thanks for sharing it with us for an hour here and there. before we start the Q&A, which we really don't have a lot of time for, just want to remind everybody that you can submit your questions via the questions field in the control panel, but we do have a couple we can tackle, I think, pretty quickly. The first one is, can you just clarify if there's any interbreeding between grizzlies and black bears?
Historically, no. Has it ever happened? It's not one that we have a lot of records on. I feel like it might have happened in a zoo scenario, but as far to my knowledge, and I will actually come back to this because I don't have a perfect answer for you, but to my knowledge, no, there isn't. And they are, like, evolutionarily, they did split off from each other quite a bit further back. I think genetically they could probably do it, but I think it's more so behaviorally. But yeah, I could potentially spin back to that one.
Okay, maybe next time. And if there's so little, let me see if I can get this question correct. If little value, if the bear skins have little value, why not reduce the number that can be killed?
So that's a totally valid question, and I'm going to take a stab at it, but this is, again, this is 100% my own opinion, is that really, if you look at it like any sort of market control, they could stop, right? So they took all those furs back because they didn't want them to be there's more to it than that. They didn't want them to be disrespected or in any way, and there's a lot of cultural reference around them too, so they brought them back because of that, and they're going to decide what to do. A lot of them probably get donated to communities. They could, right, so the cap number of tags is how much they could make. But the tricky part is this, is that if you have 20 communities that have all been used to been making, they all get 1 tag a year, and all of a sudden you're going to drop and say that there's only 5 tags per year and that would keep the value up. How do you decide where that money goes? Do you give 5 communities and they all take turns getting that money, or are there 5 hunts but then they split the money? I'm assuming these are conversations that are happening at sort of these provincial, federal, territorial levels of how to do this. At least I hope so. Because yeah, like, and then some of these hunts are sustenance, right? There are hunts that happen throughout the Arctic that are for the meat, and the hide is simply the economical part of it, right? So they still sell the skins to make the money, but they've hunted it for the food, and that is part of that too. So again, I'm pretty sure if we really wanted to do this, there's another guy named Leah Pengali, and this is like her thing, and she would be the one we'd have to get in on this because this is her wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you again. I think that's all we have time for now, so I'll turn it back to you for any closing comments.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning back in. I know we're getting close to the holidays, so happy holidays, or whether that's Christmas or solstice or Hanukkah, whatever it may be. It's just a nice time for everyone to get together. I know I'm here with my family and I'm very grateful for it. So I will come back and I will finish the story on the 27th, and hopefully we'll finally make it through some of Canada's other big predators. But it's been fun weaving in and out of the story with you, and I hope you all have a lovely week.
I also want to thank everybody who tuned in. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a wonderful day.